Guten Morgen und herzlich willkommen zum letzten Tag dieser Konferenz. Ich sehe, es gab schon Migrationen aus dem Raum raus und ich freue mich trotzdem, dass es auch Remigrationen gab, wieder zurück. Ich freue mich, viele Gesichter zu sehen, die ich schon in den letzten Tagen gesehen habe und ich danke Ihnen für Ihr kontinuierliches Interesse. Ich habe es auf jeden Fall, ich bin sehr gespannt auf diesen Tag, in dem wir uns diskursiven Aspekten aus verschiedenen Richtungen widmen werden. Und damit übergebe ich auch schon das Wort an Isabella Löhr, den Chair, Moderatorin des ersten Panels des Tages. Bitte, Isabella. Danke.
Yeah, vielen Dank, Frank, and good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome back, so to say, this morning, and I'm delighted that so many people found the way to the Besucherzentrum at that early time in the morning, and I'm very pleased to chair this panel and to introduce my three speakers, and well, I think just go in medias res immediately and start with Jim Wolfreys. He's a senior lecturer in French and European politics at King's College London, and his research interest circles around contemporary French politics, and a look at his publications reveals a really intense dealing with very recent political events in France, and I guess you had a busy week. And beyond French politics, his research focuses on fascism, political corruption, on the history of the French labor movement, on social movements in general, and on the historiography of revolution. And Jim has published widely as a journalist, writing regularly for The Guardian. He has commented on the day-to-day political events in France and Great Britain. As scholar, he has worked on racism and the emergence of European extreme right and on connections between extremist policies with neoliberal politics in Europe. And he has authored a book on the political Bourdieu, co-authored a book on the politics of racism in France. And he has co-edited a volume on history and revolution that critically deals with historical narratives that question broader social transformations as outcome of revolutionary events. And today's presentation probes into the extreme politics in France. And well, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So what I want to start with is just to address some of the themes of the conference that came up yesterday, specifically the idea of borders as violence and the framing of this violence in ways that are acceptable to liberal democracy. And I suppose what I'm going to talk about is the way in which borders don't stop at the frontier. So the way in which the extreme right in France has played a part in reshaping national identity. So if we understand national identity as something that is defined as much by what it includes as by what it excludes, that the shifting boundaries of inclusion and exclusion have played a major part in, sorry, that's my... I don't know why it's doing that. I put a timer on so I wouldn't go over 15 minutes, and it's telling me to stop already. The part that the extreme right has played in this process has been to contribute to a reshaping of perceptions of national identity in France. With the collusion of mainstream parties, particularly around questions of racism and in particular Islamophobia, but also authoritarian conceptions of democracy. So what I want to do is to look at the two waves of the development of the Front National. An initial period from the early 1980s to 2002, characterized by a rhetoric that focused on immigrants as a harmful influence in French society based on a fixation with culture rather than explicit biological racism. And then a second period from 2002 where the focus was not so much on immigrants, but on the consequences of immigration. So the fact that immigrants had children and that those descendants in French society were perceived not as full citizens of French society, but as second, third, fourth, fifth generation immigrants. So immigration, like race, became a stigma that nobody could escape, that was passed on from generation to generation. So at the center of this process has been a reconfiguration of the notion of laicity, and it's so the French Republican secular tradition and its reconstruction as a weapon that contributes to the use of a rhetoric around integration as a form of violence, as a repressive weapon to stigmatize minorities in French society. So that's what I want to develop. But first of all, I just want to look briefly at the first wave of the Front National's emergence and establishment as part of the mainstream of French political life. So what the party does in the early 80s is it manages to pick up on disaffection with the socialist party's turn to austerity in 1982, 1983, by focusing on a slogan that links immigration to unemployment. Initially, it's 500,000 unemployed or 500,000 immigrants too many. Then it becomes 1 million, then it becomes 2 million, then it becomes 3 million, and so on. So this myth that there is a connection between unemployment and immigration, like other myths targeting issues like housing, social decay more generally, education, crime, etc., they're not challenged in any substantial way by the mainstream. The rise of the Front National is countered by an abstract moral anti-racism that essentially says racism is bad, but doesn't counter the specific targets of racism and deal with those questions in any kind of concrete way. So essentially, the argument developed by anti-racism in the 1980s is that Republican integration can be a barrier both to the Front National and to the negative consequences of immigration. So the Republican tradition will counter the racism of the Front National by absorbing immigrants. And so the role of immigrants is to show that they can become French. So in a wider sense, what we're dealing with is a Republican model of integration that is counterposed to an ethnocultural model of integration. So essentially, the line of Jean-Marie Le Pen and the Front National is it's much easier to integrate the Spanish, the Italians, the Poles, who come from a Catholic tradition, than it is to integrate Muslims, essentially, immigrants from North Africa, because we have a shared culture and a shared religion. So the Republican model is counterposed to this, saying, no, the Republican model can integrate anybody. And what happens over the course of the 1990s and the 21st century is that the Republican model shifts and integration becomes increasingly something which is used in an accusatory way towards the descendants of immigrants to say, if you want to show that you can integrate, you have to modify your dress. You can't wear the hijab. You have to modify what you eat. We don't want you eating halal meat. We don't want special menus in schools for Muslim school children. We don't want separate swimming pool times for women and so on. I'll develop some of these ideas in a moment, but the turning point here is the first headscarf affair of 1989, when the issue of the hijab becomes part of a national debate. And so what structures the emergence of the Front National is a focus on immigration as a threat in terms of people coming into France. What structures this second period from 2002 is the focus on what a multicultural society looks like, and opposition to essentially multiculturalism, opposition to the existence of a diverse population in France, and specifically the descendants of immigrants. So what we see in the early part of the 21st century is the convergence of a number of factors. There's the international context, the war on terror, a narrative about Muslims as an enemy within, as a potential terrorist threat. The convergence of this with a hardening of rhetoric around the question of secularism. Paradoxically, this comes from the size of Chirac's victory. When Jacques Chirac defeats Jean-Marie Le Pen in the second round of the presidential election in 2002, those around Chirac say this is a May 68 of the right. This is a Republican upsurge behind Jacques Chirac, and we have to capitalize on this. And the way that they capitalize on it is by appropriating for themselves the rhetoric of Republican secularism. So something that had up to now been the preserve of the left becomes something that is actively pursued by the right. They set up a commission to look into the question of the wearing of the hijab in schools that leads to the law in 2004 that bans, that bans in terms of universal Republican secularism, the wearing of conspicuous religious symbols in schools. Everybody knows it's all about the hijab. Everybody knows that it's targeting Muslim school students. So there's a convergence of an international agenda and a domestic agenda, which leads to increased monitoring, scrutiny of Muslims, and the focus on them as an enemy within. So the rehabilitation of Cold War tropes, colonial tropes that dovetail with the war on terror and the increasingly intolerant trajectory of Republican secularism. The personification of this trajectory for much of the first decade of the 21st century is Nicolas Sarkozy. Nicolas Sarkozy plays a major role in legitimizing authoritarian racism by the mainstream that will eventually open the door to the Front National. The Front National has been weakened by, firstly, the resurgence of an anti-racist, anti-fascist movement in the late 1990s that isolates the organisation and contributes to a split in the party in 99. The achievement of Le Pen in getting to the second round of the 2002 election was a surprise to many in the Front National itself. The fact that they couldn't go beyond 20% in the second round of that election leads to a period of internal debate. Le Pen performs poorly in 2007, and it's not until 2010, 2011 that the party begins to revive. Many people see this as the product of the so-called detoxification of the party by Marine Le Pen. In actual fact, what happens is that the mainstream radicalizes during this period, which means that the Front National doesn't appear so extreme, because when you have a president who is targeting the dangerous classes in the banlieue, in the urban fringes of France's cities, calling them a scum or a rabble, arguing that the government will clean out these areas with a power hose, so deflecting the causes of inequality, blaming those suffering from the consequences of inequality for their situation. At the same time, radicalizing the rhetoric around secularism. There's a completely surreal debate in the 2012 election when Hollande and Sarkozy, the two candidates for the second round, spend a completely disproportionate amount of time debating the question of a group of women, it's a group of overweight women in a swimming pool in Lille who ask for an aquagym, a separate aquagym slot in the timetable of the swimming pool so that they can have their aquagym class without people making fun of them. When the press find out that some of these women are Muslim, it's portrayed as a Muslim assault on the integrity of Republican secularism that prides itself on equality between men and women. Hollande and Sarkozy debate this, spend probably as much time debating that as they do the financial crash during the presidential debate. Sarkozy makes speeches where he says, on the territory of the Republic, there will not be separate swimming pool timetables for women. Completely extraordinary focus on trivial questions that play a part in opening the door of Republican secularism to the Front National. And it's these processes, along with an attempt to rehabilitate French colonialism. Sarkozy, one of the first speeches he makes in Dakar, talks about how African man has not entered into history, that although he apologizes for French colonialism, he points out that it wasn't all bad, and then offers advice to an audience of intellectuals and students, where he says, you know, if you want to prosper in Africa, he suggests that people grow their own food. So when the president of the Republic is making speeches like this, Marine Le Pen and the Front National don't seem so extreme. So it's the adoption of a racist authoritarianism on the part of the mainstream that's contributed to the detoxification of the Front National and the inability to provide a consistent opposition to both Islamophobia and authoritarianism that helps explain why Marine Le Pen was able to get over 10 million votes in the recent elections.
Well, thanks a lot, Jim, for this very fascinating, or let's say passionate insight on French politics. And, well, we go over to Brandon, and while he's installing himself, and just go forward with presenting him. He's a lecturer, so he's somehow presenting the other side of the canal today. So I think very structurally similar problems and phenomena, just from the British perspective. He's a lecturer in the sociology of racialization and anti-Semitism at the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck in London. And before joining Birkbeck, he received his PhD from the University of Glasgow. His research focuses, so you describe yourself as historical sociologist, and his research focuses on racism, anti-Semitism, and class politics, which he combines with a pronounced interest in history. The monograph he is currently writing deals with the Bolshevik response to anti-Semitism during the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the study explores the articulation between anti-Semitism and revolutionary politics, focusing on the racialization of class politics within the revolutionary left. His presentation today extends his research interest to the present, connecting racism and xenophobia with anti-European politics, and taking Great Britain as a case study. And very welcome, and please go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks also to the organisers, Frank and Marion, for inviting me to be part of this really crucially important event. And I say that because we gather here today at a historic moment for Britain and a historic moment for Europe in general. The neoliberal settlement, crafted over 3 decades by conservative and social democratic parties across Europe, now lies in tatters, torn asunder by the most sustained economic depression since the 1930s. From Sweden to Switzerland, Belgium to Bulgaria, a tide of reactionary populism is sweeping across the European mainland, which demands nothing less than a restoration of a mythical golden age of sovereign nation states, defined by cultural and racial homogeneity. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of fascism. And Britain is not inculcated from the turbulence created by this decade-long and still unfinished crisis of late capitalism. And the most striking manifestation of this, of course, is Brexit. The talk that I want to give over the next 10-15 minutes or so, I should say, is based on an article that Satnam Verdi from the University of Glasgow and I have written for the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies, which is coming out early next year. And what I want to do in this short piece is give an account of Brexit that places questions of class, race, and empire centre stage. And I'll begin by mapping out some of the discursive dimensions of the campaign to leave the European Union. And then I'll close by giving a more structural analysis of why these discourses found so much traction in June last year. But before we begin, we should just note a couple of things. The case for Brexit was built around 2 distinct organisations. Vote Leave, the official Leave campaign made up of right-wing conservative politicians, including, for example, Boris Johnson. And the second unofficial campaign was Leave EU, led by the far-right party UKIP, whose figurehead then was Nigel Farage, who you will, of course, know all about. A defining slogan of the Vote Leave campaign was "Let's take back control." This deceptively simple slogan spoke, on the face of it, to issues of sovereignty and democracy, but it was an argument that was deeply entwined with the politics of race. And the first thing to mention here, actually, is empire. For Vote Leave advocates like Boris Johnson, the Brexit project was bound up in the re-establishment of long-standing ties with kith and kin from the old Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also actually the United States. And what attracted many Conservative politicians to Brexit was this idea of a revived Anglosphere. Liberated from the EU, Britain, once again, would be able to strut its stuff on the world stage. Indeed, one need only look at the the first speech that Theresa May made on Brexit, when she used the phrase, a truly global Britain, no less than 19 times. Now, in a country such as Britain, you cannot talk about a truly global Britain without drawing on those deep-seated imperial residues, those nostalgics in search of a lost empire that continue to shape the collective conscience of large sections of the majority population. Just to give you a flavour of this, in the weeks running up to the referendum, UKIP released a statement saying, and I quote, "Outside the EU, the world is our oyster, and the Commonwealth the peril within." And as you may have heard in the press over here, Whitehall officials were actually dubbing this new attempt to create new trade links with Africa. Internally, they were calling this Empire 2.0. Now, given this ambition to embark on a new global adventure, with the British state as primus inter pares, one might have expected Vote Leave campaigners to have undertaken at least some reckoning with the underside of the actual British imperial project. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of colonial subjugation, of the scars, both material and psychic, which have left those stigmatized populations over the course of 4 centuries. Yet not a single word. In fact, what makes the project of Brexit and a new global Britain so alluring is precisely its erasure of the racist underside of the actual imperial project of yesteryear. So the campaign for Brexit, then, actually effected an artificial rupture between Britain's historical past and its possible future. The Vote Leave campaign, then, was in many ways an exemplar of what the scholar Paul Gilroy has called post-colonial melancholia. A narrative crafted by and for those who have still not come to terms with the loss of empire and the resulting decline in global prestige that the British state has undergone since decolonisation. The colonial flag may have been pulled down in every corner of the globe, but it still flies in the collective unconscious of the majority population, as Stuart Hall once said. But running alongside this fantasy of re-establishing Britain as a global hegemon, this vision of Britain as the best in the world, was another set of narratives articulated by the key leaders of the second unofficial campaign to leave the European Union. And their vision was one of an insular British nationalism. Britain for the British. And at the heart of this was a set of concerns around immigration. According to Nigel Farage, leader of this campaign, Leave EU, the EU had done great harm to Britain by facilitating uncontrolled immigration. And this was a kind of racialization of migration in 2 senses. First, the migrant as an economic threat, and second, the migrant as a security threat. The Brexit campaign to get our borders back, to get our democracy back, to take our country back, was underscored by a racialized vision of restricting the entry of undesirables to make Britain safe again. And this, of course, reached its crescendo just days before the referendum, when Farage stood behind this breaking point poster, which depicted, apparently, Middle Eastern refugees queuing at Europe's borders. The subheading is important underneath the image. We must break free of the EU and take back control. So unlike the imperial fantasies of the official Leave campaign, this was a vision of island retreat, of pulling up the proverbial drawbridge. And as many pointed out, the image seemed to be taken straight out of the National Socialist archive. More broadly, the Breaking Point poster can only be understood against the backdrop of the way migration to Britain over the last century has been politicised and racialised. Throughout the course of the 20th century, from the arrival of Jewish migrants from Tsarist Russia to the migration of Caribbean and Asian migrants, there's always been a sustained cross-class coalition that's been opposed to their presence in Britain. Whether they were deemed not to be Christian, in the case of the Jews, or not white, in the case of Caribbeans and Asians and so on, the British nation has long been constructed in such a way that its borders have been racialised in the public imagination. And this is what the Leave campaigners understood, in a way that much of the liberal media commentariat did not. Because this history of immigration to Britain has been so thoroughly racialised over time that a reservoir of unconscious racism can be activated through the production of appropriately coded language. Or to kind of put this another way around, politicians like Farage are able to play and obey the formal rules of post-racism by at the same time, nevertheless, signalling to their public that they represent precisely the best chance of securing the old project of keeping the nation Christian and white. So what underscored the two campaigns for Brexit were two interlocking but actually contradictory visions. The first, an imperial, expansionist fantasy that sat alongside an insular project of island retreat. And if any confirmation were needed that Brexit was intimately bound up with the politics of race, then it became apparent in the unleashing of racist hate immediately after the vote on June 23rd. In the 4 weeks following the vote, over 6,000 racist hate crimes were reported to the police. And in the 4 days after the referendum result, we saw a 57% increase in racist attacks. And the kind of language that was used in these attacks were things like go home, leave, and these were followed up by statements such as we voted you out, we're out of the EU now so we can get rid of you lot, when are you going home, shouldn't you be packing your bags? These are direct quotations from a report on post-referendum racism. And in August 2016, 6 teenage boys were arrested in Essex for brutally attacking an Eastern European migrant after he was heard speaking Polish in the street, and the man subsequently died. There is something for the left to think about here, to think deeply about. How can it be that the first break from the neoliberal consensus in Britain was marbled through with such racism and such violence? How was such a political terrain crafted that saw a majority of the British population vote for Brexit visions that were stained through with a desire to recover former imperial glories, while at the same time promising to pull up that proverbial drawbridge to reduce immigration? And in the few minutes that I have left, I want to just offer a set of thoughts on how we might understand and explain this. The racism of post-Brexit Britain has its moorings not just in the aching loss of empire, but also in the structural decline that Britain has undergone since the onset of neoliberalism in the late 1970s. The discourses I've been describing for the last 10 minutes or so assert themselves today against the backdrop of Britain's comparatively marginal position in the global economy. This story of decline is important for understanding the politics of the current moment, because decline has also been accompanied by defeat. The defeat of the labour and social movements in the 1980s, a defeat that has left the working class profoundly disaggregated by region, nation, and ethnicity. In fact, the period of working class defeat under Margaret Thatcher was accompanied by another loss, the loss of those alternative frames of class resistance, including those alternative frames that imagined the working class as not just white, but black, brown, and white, and multi-ethnic. After 1945, if we just go back a bit further, after 1945, there was a historic post-war settlement in Britain that labour, to a limited degree, would be protected from capital. And it's out of this that you get the NHS and the welfare state and so on. Of course, what neoliberalism did was to take on and reverse that settlement. Under Conservative rule in the 80s, the politics of class, even the language of class solidarity, were significantly weakened. And it's these defeats, in turn, that have profoundly diminished those countercurrents of anti-racist class politics that we see in such retreat today. This is the backdrop to the racialized class politics of the current moment. What has happened in recent years is that the prospect, and in fact reality, of downward mobility has produced class injuries and collective experiences that have been recast through what we might call ressentiment. So although decline is a multi-ethnic process, it's experienced in a racialized frame, and then increasingly it's responded to by sections of the working class through the politics of resentful nationalism, and that is particularly so in the English context. Large-scale sociological data actually bears this out, that the main drivers of Englishness, of English national identity today, are Euroscepticism and a concern about immigration. And this kind of ressentiment is no longer defined as kind of imperial superiority, but a deep sense of loss of prestige, a retreat from a damaging world, a world that's no longer recognizably British as it once was. To put this another way around, the decline of empire has not led to the overcoming of the imperial complex, but its retraction into a defensive and exclusionary imaginary. We are under siege. It is time to pull up the drawbridge. And this was one of the defining features, as I mentioned, of the Leave EU campaign. But there's something else going on here. Brexit may have acted as an accelerant on those conditions that allowed racism to flourish, but it did not create them. They were birthed instead under Thatcherism and the New Labour project. And in fact, Labour, as much as any political party, has been complicit in the consolidation of a new racialised enemy within, the Muslim. And this really touches on what Jim's just been talking about. There are so many examples, but Gordon Brown in 2007 talking about British jobs for British workers, a phrase that existed only in the far right before that. To Ed Miliband in 2015, in the last general election, promising to control immigration, and in fact, making it one of his top 5 pledges in truly British fashion, putting it on a mug and selling it through the official Labour Party website. Across the political spectrum, from New Labour to the Conservatives, a powerful narrative has become dominant, a narrative that describes the loss and injuries of globalisation through the frame of the white working class. And this white working class category has really moved into the mainstream over the last decade, during, of course, the coming to terms with the economic crisis. And indeed, this is how many men and women now understand the real decline through which they have undergone. It's understood through a racialized frame of white working class victimhood. And such a category, of course, and I'm just finishing now, such a category, what that does, that category, is it elides the fact that there are black and brown members of the working class who have been disproportionately hit by the economic crisis and the politics of austerity. But when politicians talk about the working class, what they have in mind is precisely this racialized frame of the white working class. And the material force of this category, white working class, came into full view on the June 23rd vote to leave the European Union. I have some resources of hope that I think might finish on, so we could finish on a more promising note, but I'm out of time, so I'll end on a negative note. We are at 5 minutes to midnight. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brandon, and I'm very, very delighted about how wonderful these two papers interact, and I have already started to enter in a dialogue, and now I'm pleased to introduce our third speaker, of whom she's going to give a kind of...
I'm doing the positive point now.
The positive point and a kind of complementary perspective, which even broadens the spectrum, and Yulia Eckert, she's a professor for social anthropology at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And in her research, she is dealing with subjects coming from the anthropology of law, the anthropology of the modern state, citizenship, and social theories on conflict and social movements. She's, as an anthropologist, worked quite, globally in Uzbekistan, India, and Afghanistan. A focus of her research lies on law and the anthropology of law and the transnationalization of legal norms. But today...
Exactly.
Well, I just wanted to introduce your professional background, because today she's not here as a professor or as a scholar, but she's today here as a as an activist, as a civil society activist, and she's going to introduce us to Wir machen das. I won't try to translate this. So it's
we are doing it. We translate it as okay. We are doing it, and you have quite a lot of other translations if you go onto the website of this movement, as I'd like to call it.
Okay, and I would just stop here saying, go on the website of this movement, because it's really worth reading all these wonderful projects. And you are going to introduce us now with all details to this wonderful initiative.
Okay, yes, I hope I can make a bit of a positive point, because, I have a hard time after what we've just heard, which I completely agree with also. And I'm very glad that we heard a lot about the analysis of the power of the growing right wing in Europe, which resides in the very governmental representatives and policies of various governments, and I think that would hold for Germany too. From what we just have heard, I think I might have a hard time convincing you that they are not the only game in town, because there are millions of people in Germany and all over Europe who actively work for an open and diverse society, and who put all their efforts into creating a democratic polity in which those whose rights to have rights is precarious due to the law that links rights to passports. In Germany, a survey of the Protestant Church came to the estimate that there are about 6 million people currently active in pro-migrant initiatives. If you count those who only donated things, the number is about 10 million. Another study found that there are 15,000 initiatives. All these numbers are estimations, but what is striking, these numbers appear to be constant. They remained so ever since 2015. In other countries too, these numbers are constant. In Greece, the proportion of people active in such initiatives is much higher than in Germany. In Italy too, somebody was here yesterday who knows much more about the situation in Italy. There is equally a high number of people engaged in pro-migrant, pro-refugee initiatives. So why is there such a silence about the hundreds, even thousands of initiatives in Europe who have in the last years or longer worked for another, a more inclusive polity? I think we have heard quite precise analysis why there is such a silence and the political reasons for it. The oblivion towards these initiatives is highly problematic, I think. It silences the perspectives and the sort of sense of possibility that these initiatives have created. It undermines the novel ways of engaging, of living together that their pragmatic optimism has developed. The public silence that surrounds all these initiatives denies the only viable way for a humane Europe, instead telling us that we have to forever rely on fences, walls, and the criminalization of mobility. So, wir machen das, we are doing it, tries or has at its aim to overcome the silence to some degree and make visible the possibilities of a common polity that all these initiatives have created. These initiatives, I claim, are a highly political movement, a movement for another polity. But so far, this movement is a movement in itself. It is not as yet a movement for itself, that is, one that lacks a sense of collective self, and therefore lacks voice. We had a little discussion yesterday about voice. Of course, a lot of people have voice, but if nobody hears them, it is noise, not voice. So we have to create voice in order to be heard, and as we have heard, there's a lot of resistance to voice. The so-called welcome culture and the initial enthusiasm to help has often been denigrated as naive or critiqued in a more thorough critique as problematic charity. Its deeply political nature has rarely been considered. My thesis is that there has been a transformation from a rather apolitical charity to a deeply political solidarity, and that this transformation holds vital political potentials. And I want to explore this a little bit more. We did start from a strong, compassionate impulse, an impulse to help people in dire need. But from the very beginning, even at the Munich train station, there was something else. Compassion wasn't commiseration. There was joy and excitement. Sometimes, I'm sure, it was joy to be good, joy to help. But there was something more. There was something of an excitement about new things to come, about new experiences to make, and a moment of fearlessness, also to change oneself. But at that moment, I think it was still a welcome movement, hosts welcoming guests. The next step in all these initiatives was the actual concrete work to solve various concrete problems. Housing newcomers, getting them registered, getting food into some of the places where they were housed, getting them language courses or being allowed to teach them, making communication possible between everyone. This problem-solving work needed continued engagement, and again, there was often a sense of pragmatic joy, a joy in accomplishing something, finding ingenious solutions to difficulties one had not known before. Often this needed experimentation. It needed learning what worked and what did not work. What often, not always, happened in these initiatives was that helpers and newcomers grappled with problems together, both ignorant of the precise challenges, but with different and complementary competences to decipher them. There was frustration, sometimes with the divergent expectations of newcomers and oldies, with the actual hassle and immense efforts in accomplishing practical tasks. There were conflicts between professional helpers and lay enthusiasts. Tensions because the lay enthusiasts made mistakes which professionals knew too well and had for long ruled out by strict procedures. But some mistakes, I would claim, were subversive of the system. They transgressed the system in a particular manner different from the politically strategic transgressions of criminalized means of opposition that also exist, such as smuggling people, as we heard yesterday in Marion's presentation, or storming borders. Mistakes of lay enthusiasts transgressed in a serendipitous manner, discovering new ways of doing things, claiming sensible routes to a desired outcome. In this learning process, there was shock, often, at where the obstacles often actually lay. They lay in state regulation, rather than in the nature of the problems at hand or in cultural difference or such ideas that were suggested often in the media. And this shock spawned anger, awareness, and sometimes desperation, even burnout in the face of an experience of helplessness. There was an outright strike that articulated this anger. In Landsberg, a Bavarian town, the Integrationshilfe Läuft called for a general strike of volunteers to make clear that the ever-changing rules and regulations brought both refugees and resident volunteers to their limits. Still now, in 2017, you will hear weekly reports on radio stations about one or the other initiative expressing their anger about how their efforts are systematically thwarted by all sorts of regulations, most of which appear as inhumane and detrimental to a productive way of living together. I think it was then that the welcome movement started turning into a movement for another Germany in which we could live together, in which the state administration would be supportive of the efforts of civil society actors tackling practical problems. As Serhat Karakayale has pointed out, it was the German middle class, a class that usually considers the German state as its propriety, that suddenly experienced this state administration as obstructive of its efforts and engagements. It was the face of the state they had not known so far. Why was it made impossible to reunite a Syrian family from Aleppo to Bavaria when a well-to-do Bavarian served as a sponsor and surety for the whole family? Why was it impossible to legally employ a young Afghan man in a bakery where he was the best apprentice of all? And so on. The examples are numerous, and I'm sure you know many of them. The experience with administration, with the absurdity of a dehumanizing legal regime, led to a politicization. But there was still no ideological positioning, because what I would call a movement for in itself was extremely heterogeneous. It was not only heterogeneous in the sense of being constituted by the most diverse people, alliances between left-wing activists and very even conservative middle-class people, but it was also an utterly unorganized movement. There was no collective action despite several attempts at online networking. In another context, I have called such unorganized collective action practice movements. Such movements are defined by forms of practice that are oriented towards goals that reside above all in some improvement of everyday possibilities of living. Goals and claims are articulated not in manifestos or declarations, but rather in acts of citizenship, as Engin Isin has called it. Now, Werner Schiffauer has pointed out in his analysis of the German pro-newcomer initiatives that these differ from practice movements in that they do not strive for the betterment of their own lives, but for a better world. In some way, this is true. But I would say that striving for a better world is striving for a betterment of one's own life as well. This is precisely the transformation from charity to solidarity that I think was observable. Starting from striving for an improvement for others, it turned into striving for another world one wanted to live in. So, several questions arose for me. How did compassion turn into a sense of solidarity? And how did this solidarity take on a universalist tone spanning vast differences? Differences of money, obviously, access, cultural capital, legal status, but also differences of norms and values. And the third question, did the possibility of a universalist solidarity rather than a communitarian solidarity hold precisely because it arose from compassion? As I said earlier, charity and compassion have often been denounced as either naive or as reaffirming the asymmetries that make it necessary in the first place. Charity allocates a role of passivity to the receivers of charity and thereby fixes those in the need of aid in their identity as victims rather than as agents of their fate. Moreover, charity has been analyzed to operate only at the level of symptoms and thereby to invisibilize the structural causes of suffering. Solidarity, on the other hand, has been the rallying cry of many an emancipatory movement. It could be said to unite those in a similar predicament to better their lot. Often solidarity is thus communitarian. This holds for class as well as for fraternities of elites. However, sometimes solidarity takes a universalist turn. Nina Glick-Schiller uses the term cosmopolitanism for such universalist solidarity. She defines it by a recognition of human commonality and stresses the need to tone down our attention to difference and rather explore what is common to us all. While I would agree that there was often a recognition of human commonality in these initiatives, I would argue that this recognition was only one facet of universalist solidarity emerging, and possibly not always the central one. While there was often the experience of commonality, there was also deep experience of difference. As I said, difference of norms and values, of tastes and aspirations. Such experience of difference were equally quotidian as the recognition of commonality, and it was often hard to deal with them. My argument is that it was in the face of such experience of commonality and difference, in a way irrespective of difference or commonality, that a universalist solidarity arose. It was rather in the face of the political nature of inequality. Inequality not only in economic terms, but in terms of the legal structure of world society, which limits the right to have rights to the privileged citizens of a few Western democracies. It was thus the denaturalization and repoliticization of inequality that made such universalist solidarity possible. There was, thus, a growing sense of injustice at the core of charity turning into solidarity. It was, above all, the experience with German asylum law and asylum administration which appeared as counterproductive to the efforts also of these middle-class people involved in all these initiatives. This novel experience of German law and German administration led to a new sense of our entanglement with the suffering we encountered, being obstructed from effectively helping the injustice of the war in Syria, the injustice of the European border regime, putting so many lives at peril, lives that could have been saved and had their right to protection under the Geneva Convention being granted before the journey to protection, appeared in a new, more personal light. And there was also the injustice of state distinctions between deserving and undeserving refugees, which just clashed with the fates of those thus classified. To experience these as unjust, it needed personal experience. It was the experience of the contradiction between what was before one's eyes and what was the rule. It seems to me that universalist solidarity, unlike communitarian solidarity, arises from such compassion. Compassion irrespective of commonalities or differences, compassion with the other in the sense of Butler's reading of Levinas. It is a compassion as a responsibility demanded by the other. It is an obligation one has by being in the world together. I want to venture the thesis that universalist solidarities, inasmuch as it is based on compassion as an obligation towards the other, transforms giving into sharing. Sharing is not a form of exchange. Here's the anthropologist speaking. Sharing does not demand reciprocity, and therefore, if reciprocity is not possible, does not create the same inequalities as unrequited giving and gifting. The poison of the gift that has accompanied the analysis of gift-giving ever since Marcel Mauss started it, and that has taken its particular form in humanitarianism, is not at issue when what is given is an entitlement of the one who receives it. This transformation, to some degree, not entirely, overcomes the distinction of welcoming hosts and grateful guests, and more importantly, the claim to ownership naturalized through the nationalist organization of world society. It provides glimpses of another base for polity, namely our coexistence. So, does the moralization of politics that Didier Fassin has observed necessarily lead to its depoliticization? Is it a mystification which replaces a structural analysis of crisis and of suffering? I see the structural critique of universalist solidarity engendered through the politics of help to lie in the loss of the plausibility of a nationalist logic of distributive justice. It practices a logic of sharing and thereby makes another world thinkable. This is very precarious, I admit, and maybe still naive, but I think it is precarious because it was more experienced and practiced than it was thought. It was unarticulated and is still unarticulated. But it seems to me that the pertinent questions towards help that a perspective of humanitarian reason has raised might actually make invisible the deeply political character of such engagements and the transformative potentials of helping. These initiatives that started from a compassionate impulse are political in a sense of acting on a novel imagination of the body politic. They practically work and explore what society we want to live in. In their serendipitous explorations, they create such a society, showing what is possible. They're doing it. So, if this politics fails in effecting institutional transformation, it is not because of the naivety or the depoliticization often attributed to help, but because those engaged in it fail to organize. It is politics that does not articulate its political nature. It lacks ideology. And it is dispersed, local, and not very media savvy. The politics of help stands against both governmental counter moves and the loud-wing, right-wing extremism that governments listen to. But so far, these initiatives have sustained themselves against all obstacles. There are still so many people engaged in these projects, and the mood did not turn. It turned from enthusiasm to commitment, I would say. And I think we have realized that we have to further fight for it. I'll stop here because I think I'm already over the time.
Thank you very much, Julia, for giving this broad picture and this vision somehow, which I guess is a very helpful and warmly welcomed vision after having heard the other two papers, which is I hope you understand this. So the floor is open for comments, questions. So there's the first commenter. So let's start here in the two rows, and then go back to the.
Yeah, thank you very much for these papers. I'm Thomas Lindenberger from Potsdam ZZF, and I have a question to Brandon and to Yulia. First to Yulia, I was always struck, or let's say, I see a paradox in this whole Willkommenskultur, in the fact that it brings out something which had been nourished by the state over decades, namely the furthering and the, so to speak, deliberate motivation of self-organization of citizens, the field of engagement politics. You have a deliberate policy of the state since the 90s to make citizens take their affairs in their own hands, which is part of the neoliberal project, cutting down welfare programs, etc., etc. And this is now brought out in this enormous self-activization of the citizens in 2015, but I think this paradoxical relation to state-enabled structures, which includes a lot of very important legal stuff, legal norms, the ability of citizens to use all these infrastructures which are necessary in order to organize things, to get things done, which are absolutely crucial, and which, as far as I have read about these things, are also crucial at the very grassroots level of activities, where it's always a constant game of interaction with authority representatives. Maybe even the ones who represent the authorities in a free time way, as a ehrenamtlicher Bürgermeister and so on, but they are nevertheless functionaries of the state. How is this paradox reflected in what you are doing, and how should one reflect on it? Because I think it shows that this is nevertheless, to the extent that it's a civil society movement, it's nevertheless very much a state citizens movement. And I think this paradox needs reflection. A question to Brandon, or let's say sharing a German experience, which is that on the long run, among German historians, would always say glass is a race thing. It never has been different. In Germany, working class, was always a race thing. And so how, because you were kind of, as I thought, articulating this kind of a frustration with the fact that now class turns out to be a white race thing in England in particular. And I was wondering, what else has it actually ever been different?
Second question from Bashar. No, Bashar is next, and then we go back.
To continue on the point about what Brandon said about the explanation along the white racism and along the nostalgia for colonial times. On the first one, it doesn't fit well with the anti-Polish workers, and it features well in your slides. So the anti-Polish one is mainly against competing workers, and it's more xenophobia and nationalism, may be fueled by economic stagnation of the working class, but not the kind of racism that you're alluding to. And perhaps also the nostalgia for colonialism is not as operative as a nostalgia for better economic times for working class. And the reference of May to truly global is to address the fears of isolation from the markets of Europe. So this always referring to racism and colonialism might be overdone in this case, I think. There are more clear economic explanations that can explain easily those attitudes and explains it better, I think. Now, question to Jim about the explanation. I agree with a lot of what you have said, but it looks like to me it's a thin explanation to go to the Jacques Chirac misreading of the consensus on his election as triggering that thing. Because there is something odd about French elections and the presence of the far right in France. As a Western European country, France has the biggest size of radical nationalists in it compared to all other countries. I'm talking about Germany, England, Spain, Italy, even of course North, including Netherlands. And this goes back even before this, even before the crisis, even before the 2008 financial crisis, and before the rise of the left. And even if you look at there's something also odd in the general spectrum of elections. I mean, 3 of the main 4 contenders, those who did not win, they happen also to be at least Putin-friendly and Assad-friendly, even the ones who are on the right. This big size of nationalists on the left and on the right is a peculiarly French thing in the Western European scene. I'm excluding Austria probably in this example. But in that sense, the explanation might be deeper and more historical to explain that strong presence of the national right politics in France as compared to its similar countries. Thank you very much.
Is it working? Ah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. In welcher Sprache soll ich jetzt antworten? I think I'll keep in English because then my co-presenters will also understand. And this is particularly pertinent because I think a lot of members that were active in these initiatives are very comfortable with the German state. And it was really a completely novel experience of the German administration in these movements. But I mean, in a way, my hope would be that there would be a transformation from a movement about a new society to a movement also to another state. But I am not very optimistic about this right now. I think there are so many forces working against it, and I think the sort of national logic is so entrenched that it is very, very, very difficult to overcome. As long as all these self-evident things, or things taken as self-evident, are not, there is no alternative really articulated that people can identify with. So, and also the other thing is that I think it is not the state. Different parts of the state played very different roles. Some of these sort of, mayors played a completely different part than did de Maizière. I mean, so, and they were in some ways part of this movement and were part of this civil society movement. So I'm not quite sure whether I've completely answered it, but I also think we cannot tell yet really what will become of that.
Hi, thanks a lot for both questions, both really important questions. Just to take the first one, it's interesting that you say that in the German literature, academic literature, class is always race, or class is always raced in that way.
In a critical rereading.
Sure, no, sure, in a critical rereading. It's interesting you say that, because in the British class debate, or the debate on class in the British context, precisely the opposite seems to me to be the case, and that race is always left out of the discussion. You can see that if you look at most of the kind of dominant currents in class studies. I'm thinking mostly of the sociological literature. The role, the historic and contemporary role of racialization of class politics and class is precisely what's elided. So that's part of the reason why I was pressing in that direction. Because I guess I'm pressing against, I hesitate to say dominant paradigm, but a strong current in class studies. I was pressing against that. This was maybe an internal British conversation. Sorry to do that. But you say, class has always been raced in that critical reading. I think there's a lot of truth to that, in the sense that if you look at the work of Satnam Vardi, who I wrote this paper with, actually, his last book really shows the historical incorporation of sections of the working class into both the nation and a racialized nation over time. But what I think it would be wrong to only tell that side of the story. There's another countercultural side to that history, which is those class movements which precisely pressed against the racialization of class politics. It's those multi-ethnic class formations in different periods of British history. And in Satnam in his book charts that really, really well. I think what marks the current moment as both worrying and distinct is the fact that those alternative frames of class, those alternative frames of reference, those multi-ethnic class imaginaries are in retreat, because the labour movement itself is in retreat. That's what makes our current moment so dangerous. But there is another side to that as well, in the general retreat from collectivism that's come to define the neoliberal moment has also been accompanied by a curious kind of gain of the last anti-racist class movement, which was the 1970s. And one of the gains we've got from the last period is a kind of indifference and general acceptance of multicultural everyday reality among younger generations who are quite depoliticized in many ways, but nevertheless are quite at ease with the fact of multicultural reality. So in that sense, the victories of the past have their returns in the present, even though the politics itself has suffered a defeat. We can nevertheless trace some of the gains that have been made. Sorry, am I talking for too long? Yeah. Sorry, okay. Just very, very quickly, then the last point, anti-Polish xenophobia is not racism, it's not imperial racism. That's precisely the point I was trying to make. There's two interlocking visions in Brexit. One is about imperial expansion, the other one's about island retreat, and I think the anti-Polish racism that we see is precisely of the second form. And you're right that Theresa May, when she talks about a truly global Britain, she's trying to allay fears of isolationism. But my point is you cannot talk about a truly global Britain without bringing up those deep-seated reservoirs, those imperial residues. And I'm not saying that the only reason Theresa May talks about a truly global Britain is because of this imperial expansionism, but you cannot do it without articulating those. That's my argument. Sorry for speaking for so long.
So on the question of the Chirac in 2002, I think that's absolutely right. That there's much more to the explanation than that. If you look at and it's the question really of, well, where do these ideas come from? How did they emerge? Do we trace them back to some kind of national particularity and so on? Or are there other factors? I think if you look at opinion polls, you'll see in the mid to late 60s, about 66% of the population thought there were too many Arabs in France. Exactly the same figure in the 80s and 90s. The difference is that question of immigration had become center stage. And so I think that it's important to recognize that those ideas don't just drop from the sky and get picked up by politicians. They're politically constructed. And that political construction has many different elements to it that go beyond just Republican secularism. So I think in terms of the distinction I was making between immigration as a kind of invasion, as it was portrayed in the 80s, and then the consequences of immigration and the focus on Islam and culture and religion in particular. Both aspects of that are part of a project led by the far right, in particular the so-called New Right, the Nouvelle Droite, to shift the emphasis from race to culture, so to make racism respectable. But what happened was that the focus on immigration set up an impossible challenge for politicians. So every politician said, immigration, is a problem that we have to get tough on, we have to deal with and so on, because immigration was perceived as being the cause of all these other social problems. Because the other social problems didn't go away, it simply became a demonstration of governmental impotence to say, vote for change, we'll get tough on immigration, we'll deal with crime, we'll deal with unemployment, we'll deal with housing problems and so on. The crisis, the inequalities deepened, and so authoritarianism was also a key element in the rise of the far right. And that's where 2002 was a turning point in the right engaged with the left in making Republican secularism a tool for both racism and authoritarianism. So it reaches its height with the state of emergency, and that accentuates the state of exception that black and Arab bodies are subjected to. So it's not simply Chirac doing that. It's also, Manuel Valls. There was the socialist prime minister there was a case of a prison in Grenoble that said it would serve halal meat to prisoners. And there was an outcry against it, and they were taken to court. Valls said this is an essential battle for the values of the Republic. So it was the participation of the left also in that that contributed to it. Beyond what the right had did, the right contributed to making it respectable, but it was that respectabilization of racism so that Islamophobia became a progressive form of racism. Female students could be asked to take off the hijab for their own liberation. So that use of secularism as an injunction to, if you really want to become French, this is what you have to do, chimed with a whole lot of other historical trajectories that, yes, are rooted in things that go back much further. France's colonial history, the link between republicanism and the state as part of nation building in France, the construction from above of that also led to an acceptance, a consensus that went from the radical left to the extreme right on those questions.
Well, thank you very much. I think, so actually we're already over time, but we can take about 5 minutes. Okay, then we have 2 to 3 questions, please, very, very short and concise. And I think in the back room there are many. 3 questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Very,
I'm
very
just
short.
conscious of time. Very quickly, thank you for 3 very great talks. My question was to Dr. Brendan McGeever. Where do you fit in Polish and Eastern European workers in Britain, given that they're the dominant migrant group at this moment? Where do they fit into the multicultural settlement in Britain? And how do you conceptualize the racism and discrimination that they actually face? Where's the difference between xenophobia and racism, etc.? So,
question to Yulia. I'm also engaged in this grassroots movement myself, but that where I'm really worried of is that what had been the achievements of the last decades, starting with that Germany is a country of immigration, starting with a view to the revolutionary movements in the third world. I remember on the Liga Against Imperialism, where we met every week, making solidarity with a new country, that we've had to look at the map where it is, and here all these things. All the grassroots movements in many fields, as for the health movement, and that it looks at the moment for me that's not that just what's happening now is that this is the main point that they're rolling back, and that's there. Do you really think that this grassroots movement of today has a strength and has a place in the political and in the place of society, where it's really can make something like a movement that, because if you look at Macron, he has to do from a march to a real, I don't want to say political party, but to something organized, to really to have the influence and the strength into society, to change something in society and politics, and against all these things that we know, and that what AfD is the most important thing is not only dealing with immigration, but is this rolling back in the whole field of society?
Okay, thanks. We have a last question of the lady with a pink scarf. Well, she were.
Yes, thank you. Okay, if Sarkozy government produced a place for rights, then how could Macron take it away? And do the East European stole the works from the Britain with jumping jobs and so on? Is the fear from East Europeans the reason from Brexit? And yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and please 3 short answers.
Yes. I do agree with you that I'm also skeptical, but there is a potential, and this potential is, in a way, our only chance. So we have to become louder, we have to organize better. Whether we do it in the form of a political party, I know that there is a woman, she was a member of the Greens, she left the Greens in order to start a party who unites all these initiatives. I haven't heard of it since. I went to her website, the website is empty, so these are the problems we are facing, and the problems possibly also because it is such a diverse movement. It's not that easy to unite these people. Not all members would immediately say, you know, let's do without borders. You know, there are very diverse positions, political positions, also part of it. But this was the case when the Greens started as well in the ecological movement. They were also really diverse positions, and still they managed to become extremely influential. So I think there is this potential, we have to use it. I'm also very, very worried that it will be simply squandered, that it will be thwarted by all the opposition from the governments. But I wanted to point out it is there, and you know, it is still there. It has some persistence, so let's use it.
Really great couple of questions I think are related. Just very, very quickly, how do I conceptualize the relationship between anti-Polish xenophobia, I think you used the term, and the more, you know, and the concept of racism, which I was using? I think it's an important question, and we do need to think more about this. I don't think there's a consensus in the British sociological literature on race and racism about how we name and place this. Just one quick thing I would say though, although the anti-Polish discourse and violence is marked by seeing the migrant as an economic threat primarily, it cannot be understood without the historic racialization of the nation and its borders. That is the most important thing to grasp here. And actually, in the racist blowback of Brexit itself, you see that those articulating the racism don't hold to these distinctions. We voted leave to get you out. That statement is directed not just at Poles, but at long, you know, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th generation British Muslims and Black Caribbeans. So we need to have conceptual clarification on this, but not be too rigid so as to see the very real overlapping in the different forms of racialization of the nation and its borders. That's what I would say in response.
Okay, so I think the short answer to if Sarkozy opened up a space for the far right, can Macron take it away, is no. I think that's because part of the spiral that has unfolded over the last 2 decades, in particular in France, has been about the inability of neoliberalism, a neoliberal economic outlook, to generate popular affiliation. And so politicians have resorted to negative scapegoating in order to shore up popular support. That's what was behind the 2004 law and the 2010 law banning the niqab. And that spiral is very difficult to unwind. Macron already is starting from a weaker base in terms of positive affiliation. I think his victory, like Fillon's victory against Sarkozy, is partly the expression of a view that Sarkozy took things too far and it became ridiculous. You know, Sarkozy in his campaign said, when talking about school students who didn't want pork, well, they'll have to take a double portion of chips. And this was seen as, you know, this is not statesmanlike, this is ridiculous. And so Macron represents a pushback against that, much more, I think, along the lines of David Cameron's muscular liberalism. Are those the politics that will act as a viable barrier against the rise of the extreme right in France, not without addressing the problems of inequality, extreme social polarization and so on that Macron's presidency is likely to accentuate?
Well, I think we're now at the close. Thank you very much to our three speakers and it's really inspiring and discussion-provoking papers. Thanks to the audience, and Brendan asked me to thank the audience that everybody spoke English, so thanks to you. And now we have a coffee break until 11 o'clock.